Hello, my name is Chloe Newton, and this is my extra credit assignment for ethics, scenario 4. So, the case that I decided to look into for this assignment involved a young boy named Charlie Gard, who was born full term and apparently healthy in London of August 2016. And soon after he was born, some medical symptoms started to display, and it was found that he had a really rare inherited genetic disorder that involves mitochondrial DNA dysfunction and depletion. And so the shortened term for this disease is MDDS. And with this rare disease, there was only 4 people at the time of this case that were also diagnosed with this disease, 4 people in the world. This disease brings about a lot of organ dysfunction and organ system dysfunction, muscle issues. So Charlie Gard, just a little infant, was not able to hold himself up. He had no arm or leg strength. His heart, liver, and lungs had issues. He couldn't breathe on his own, and he was very unresponsive emotionally and physically to his caregivers and his doctors. So that's just some background information of his health and well-being. So since he couldn't breathe on his own, he was placed on life support. The ventilator needed to help him breathe, and it was portrayed from his doctors that he only had 6 to 9 months to live. So, as any parent would want to do, Charlie's parents went searching for an alternative route of care, something that might keep him alive or that might alleviate his symptoms even more. And they actually found an experimental study that was going on in the United States, and it's called nucleoside therapy. And I think it's worth mentioning that this therapy had never been tested on animals or humans, so it was very trivial to go through with this treatment. But I mean, these parents were desperate. It's their child, and they obviously want to see him grow up, and they want to see him not suffer from this condition. So the ethical dilemma that presented itself with this particular case is Charlie's parents wanting to try this experimental treatment, but all of his doctors and even the court system advising against this form of treatment for many reasons that I will go over, but they ultimately thought that Charlie should be taken off of life support and placed in palliative care, so that for the remainder of his life he would be taken care of in a well manner. So that's the critical incident. Moving on to the ethical principles. The first one that I feel should be considered in this situation is respect for autonomy. So obviously Charlie is not old enough or even capacitated enough to portray his own autonomy and to stand up for his own decisions, because he was only a newborn, pretty much. So in situations like this, usually autonomy will be placed into the caregiver's hands, so Charlie's parents. But in this unique situation, when we call into question Charlie's well-being and what is the best decision for the child, his parents' decision was not taken lightly by his medical professionals and his doctors, because they felt that trying to have Charlie sent overseas to the United States to undergo a treatment that was backed by no evidence, they just thought it was kind of absurd, and so they eventually called in an ethics committee to assess the case. And so even though autonomy was technically placed into Charlie's parents' hands, ultimately the control was given to the court system, since this was such a complex case. So the next principle that I wanted to talk about is non-maleficence. So since Charlie was unresponsive and it was really hard to tell if he was undergoing any kind of suffrage or if he was fine, nobody knew at all. It was, I guess, the main driving force from his doctors was non-maleficence. All they wanted to do was make sure that he wasn't going through any pain. They wanted to do whatever they could to lessen any further pain, which they thought could stem from this experimental treatment in the United States, the nucleoside therapy, and also keeping him on life support. Non-maleficence would play into that, because if he was suffering, he was, there was nothing that could be done about it, keeping him on the ventilator. This leads into the ethical principle of justice. So, although from an outsider's perspective, it's easy to side with the doctors in this case, because we don't want to think of a little boy suffering when he doesn't have to, and when it seems like there's no real solution. You have to place yourself in the shoes of his parents. Obviously all they want is for him to survive and for him to have a chance at life, because they've already had, I want to say he was about 2 years old when he passed away, so they had a considerable amount of time to care for their child. And so seeing that they completely eliminated the option of palliative care and taking him off life support, the only options they were really left with were keeping him on life support or traveling overseas to the United States so that he could undergo the nucleoside therapy. And this brings into question justice and equitable rights of a patient, because for a patient such as Charlie, and with his disease and with his situation, it's not fair that the parents have to come up with the funds just to keep him alive, because the only way he was going to be able to stay alive was if he was kept on life support, which is very expensive. And so it's not fair that the only options they clearly saw were, okay, we have to spend every cent we own just to keep him alive so that we can figure out if there is anything we can do, or we're just going to have to take a leap of faith and trust this experimental treatment that's never been tested before. And so I thought that was worth mentioning, justice in his case. So historical context, I've already given a lot of context on the case. He was diagnosed with the disease and limited his functioning in many areas of life. So there was a lot of public campaigns that went into this case, and his parents were actually able to raise enough money through the public eye to keep him on life support while they tried to figure out what to do regarding his treatment, and while they went through many, many court hearings. So the different stakeholders involved in this case were Charlie and his parents, the hospital he was admitted to, and the medical professionals assigned to his case. We had the European Court of Human Rights involved, the Family Division of the High Court. We even had the Pope and the President of the United States, Trump, involved in this case. That's how widespread it became. And it just really shows how serious and prevalent disputes between caregivers and doctors can be. So organizational and legal concepts. The main part of this case was ensuring that Charlie's best interests were upheld. And from a medical standpoint, and as somebody who wants to be a medical professional, lessening his suffering from the disease is the driving factor here. So after several court hearings and pleads from his parents, the lead judge on the case ultimately did determine that Charlie should be removed from life support and placed into palliative care. So that was one of the case resolutions I came up with, was that his life support is removed and placed in palliative care. And the other two alternatives I've suggested were the parents bring Charlie overseas for the experimental treatment, or they try to keep him sustained on life support as long as they can until either they find another form of treatment or his life just gives out. And so I think that the best option was to go with what happened, and that would be removing him from life support and placing him in palliative care.